When James, a man on the edge of financial collapse, stumbles upon a wallet packed with cash, he faces a life-altering decision. But his choice leads to something far greater than he ever expected, sending shockwaves through an entire community. What happens when one small act of honesty sets off a chain reaction no one saw coming? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. James Parker had always prided himself on being a man of integrity. A husband, a father, and a dedicated worker, he was no stranger to hard times. But recently, life had become harder than he had ever imagined. Once employed at a local manufacturing plant, James had been laid off unexpectedly when the company downsized. The factory had been the lifeblood of the community for years, employing countless men and women from the neighborhood. Now, like so many others, James found himself on the wrong side of the economic downturn, jobless and with no immediate prospects. The bills were piling up. Rent was due, the electricity bill loomed large, and the growing list of unpaid expenses felt like a heavy weight on his chest. He had 2 children, Amy and Daniel, who depended on him, and a wife, Sarah, who had been his rock throughout the ups and downs of their lives. But even her optimism was beginning to crack under the pressure. There were only so many days she could reassure him that something would come along before doubt started creeping into her voice. James spent his days searching for work, walking from one end of the city to the other, looking for anyone who might be hiring. He knocked on doors, filled out job applications, and followed up on every possible lead. His shoes were wearing thin, and his wallet, once full of promise, now held only a few crumpled bills and a reminder of the rent due date. Despite the bleakness of his situation, James remained determined not to let his family down. He couldn't afford to. Every step he took was for Sarah, for Amy, and Daniel, and for the future he still believed in, no matter how distant it seemed. On one particularly hot afternoon, after yet another day of disappointment, James was walking back home, the sun casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. His thoughts were heavy. He thought about the previous night, how Amy had asked for new shoes for school, not knowing that her father's bank account was near empty. He thought about Sarah, who had taken on extra hours at the local diner just to keep food on the table. They hadn't said it out loud, but both of them knew they were on the brink of losing everything if something didn't change soon. James walked down Main Street, his eyes on the ground, lost in his thoughts, when something unusual caught his attention. There, lying just ahead on the sidewalk, was a leather wallet. The rich brown color stood out against the gray concrete. He stopped in his tracks, staring at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. His mind immediately went to the possibility that someone had dropped it without noticing. It could have belonged to anyone passing through town that day. Glancing around, James saw that the street was almost deserted. No one was nearby, no frantic person searching for lost belongings. The wallet sat there, untouched, as if it were waiting for him to pick it up. Curiosity and a strange sense of duty tugged at him as he bent down and scooped it up. He held the wallet in his hands, turning it over a few times, inspecting it. It was thick, the kind that looked expensive, with the scent of polished leather still fresh. His fingers traced over the stitching, and he hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside, his eyes widened. It wasn't just a wallet with a few dollars. It was filled with cash. His heart skipped a beat as he flipped through the bills. There had to be at least a few $100s in there, maybe more. Then, nestled among the cash, he found several credit cards and business cards. The name on the cards jumped out at him: Jacob Harris. That name was familiar. Jacob Harris was a well-known businessman in the community. He owned several properties and was well respected for his work ethic and philanthropic efforts. James had never met the man personally, but his reputation preceded him. Everyone knew who Jacob Harris was. James stood there for a moment, staring down at the wallet. His mind raced with possibilities. Here, in his hands, was a sum of money that could temporarily lift the financial burden off his family's shoulders. He could buy groceries, pay the rent, maybe even get Amy those shoes she'd asked for. His problems could be solved, at least for a little while, if he kept the money. But deep down, James knew better. He had been raised to believe that honesty mattered more than anything, even in times of struggle. It wasn't about what people could get away with. It was about doing the right thing when no one was watching. His father had taught him that, and James had always lived by that principle. His children, Amy and Daniel, looked up to him. What kind of example would he be setting if he took what wasn't his, even if no one would ever find out? He sighed deeply and closed the wallet, making his decision. He couldn't keep it. The money didn't belong to him, and he knew what he had to do. Jacob Harris might have a lot of wealth, but that didn't mean James had the right to take what wasn't his. Besides, if he were in Harris's shoes, wouldn't he hope someone would return his lost belongings too? James looked around once more, then carefully tucked the wallet into his pocket. He wasn't sure how he would find Mr. Harris, but he was determined to return it to him. As he started walking again, his mind was already planning his next steps. He would find Harris's office, return the wallet, and hopefully restore the man's faith in the honesty of others. As James walked back toward his home, his heart felt lighter, despite the continued weight of his family's financial troubles. He didn't know what would come of this decision, but one thing was clear: he had done the right thing. And in that small act of integrity, James Parker took his first step toward a future he couldn't yet imagine, a future shaped by honesty, kindness, and the unexpected twists of fate that life often throws our way. The walk home felt longer than usual for James. Every few minutes, his hand unconsciously patted his pocket, reassuring himself that the wallet was still there. The weight of it seemed symbolic now, not just the physical presence of the money and credit cards, but the emotional and moral weight it carried. He knew he was doing the right thing, but it didn't make the temptation any less real. Every step reminded him of the rent that was overdue, the mounting bills, and the empty fridge waiting at home. When he arrived at the modest house he and Sarah had rented for years, he stood outside for a moment, staring at the front door. He couldn't bring himself to walk in and explain everything to her just yet. The exhaustion from job hunting, the discovery of the wallet, and the internal battle he was fighting had drained him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if he just used the money. Maybe Harris wouldn't notice a few $100s gone. Maybe James could tell himself it was a loan he would repay someday. But then, as quickly as the thought entered his mind, James pushed it away. He knew better than that. His father had always told him, "Your character is all you have when the world takes everything else away." And right now, with no job, no savings, and no clear future ahead of him, James clung to that wisdom. His character was all he had left. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and walked inside. The smell of something cooking on the stove hit him as soon as he opened the door. Sarah was standing in the small kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, another inexpensive meal stretched as far as it could go. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose bun, and she looked up as he entered, a tired but loving smile on her face. "How did it go today?" she asked, though they both knew the answer before the words left her mouth. James hesitated. He didn't want to burden her with his disappointment again, but the truth hung heavy in the air. "Nothing yet. I'll keep looking tomorrow." Sarah nodded, her expression remaining calm and supportive. She had heard this same refrain for weeks, but her belief in him never wavered. "It's okay. Something will come up. I know it will." Her voice was steady, but the slight tremble in her hands as she stirred the pot betrayed the worry she tried to hide. James stood there for a moment, wanting to tell her about the wallet, wanting to share the strange dilemma he was in. But he knew that if he said it out loud, they'd have to confront the temptation together, and that didn't feel fair. Sarah had enough on her plate. Instead, he pulled out a chair at the small kitchen table and sat down, watching her work. "Anything I can do to help?" he asked, trying to lighten the mood. She shook her head, smiling softly. "Nope, just sit. Soup's almost ready." The children, Amy and Daniel, soon ran into the kitchen, their laughter filling the small house. They were too young to fully understand what their parents were going through, but James knew they were beginning to pick up on the tension. Kids always did. They sat down at the table, excited for dinner, their innocent smiles a reminder of what truly mattered. As they ate, James was quiet, He nodded and smiled when appropriate, listening as Amy talked about her day at school and Daniel excitedly explained how he had kicked the ball the furthest during recess. But all the while, his mind was on the wallet and the decision that lay ahead of him. That night, after the kids had gone to bed and the house was quiet, James finally sat down with Sarah in the living room. They didn't need words in moments like this. The comfort of her presence was enough. They watched the flickering light from the TV, neither of them really paying attention to what was on the screen. Finally, James spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "Sarah, something happened today." She turned to him, her brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out the wallet, placing it on the coffee table between them. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. "Where did you?" "I found it on the sidewalk," James explained. "It's full of cash and credit cards. It belongs to a man named Jacob Harris. You've heard of him, right? He owns several businesses around town." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the wallet. "I know who he is." Her voice was cautious, and James could see the conflict already brewing in her mind. "I'm going to return it to him," James said firmly, cutting through the silence. "It's the right thing to do." Sarah looked at him, her expression a mixture of relief and something else, something like regret or maybe understanding of the sacrifice James was making. "Of course, it's the right thing," she said softly. "But James, you know we could really use that money, just to get us through the next few weeks. Maybe just a small amount?" James shook his head, the decision already made in his heart. "I've thought about that. Trust me, I have. But I can't take what doesn't belong to me. That money isn't ours. I don't want to set that example for Amy and Daniel. What kind of lesson would that be?" Sarah sighed, leaning back against the couch. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're right. You've always done the right thing, James. She hesitated, clearly struggling with her emotions. "I just want things to get better for us." "They will," James said, though even he wasn't sure if he fully believed it. "I'll return the wallet tomorrow. And after that, we keep pushing forward. Something will come through." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands, each lost in their own thoughts. Despite the financial strain, there was a quiet strength between them, a bond that years of hardship had only deepened. As the night wore on, James found himself thinking less about the money in the wallet and more about what it represented. It was a test, he realized. A test of character, of faith, and of the principles he had always believed in. Life had given him a choice, and though the easy way out was right there in front of him, he knew that the harder path was the one he had to take. He went to bed that night with a clear mind, ready to face the next day. Tomorrow, he would return the wallet, and with it, his faith in doing the right thing. The next morning, James woke with a renewed sense of purpose. Despite the swirling uncertainty of his life, today had a clear direction. His decision to return the wallet was set, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control over something. He got dressed quietly, careful not to wake Sarah or the kids, who were still fast asleep. He slipped the wallet into his jacket pocket and headed out the door, the early morning sun casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. The streets were peaceful, still waking up to the day. James made his way toward downtown, where Jacob Harris's office was located. He had never been to Harris's building, but it wasn't hard to find. Everyone in the city knew where it was, a sleek, modern office block that stood out amidst the older, more worn-down buildings of the area. Harris had made a name for himself over the years, building a reputation not just for his business acumen, but also for his charitable work. He funded local initiatives, sponsored youth sports teams, and had even donated to renovate the local community center. James couldn't help but wonder what kind of man Harris would turn out to be in person. Was he as generous and kind as people said, or was there something else behind the public image? He wasn't sure what to expect, but he hoped that Harris would appreciate his effort to return the wallet, though James wasn't looking for a reward or recognition. Doing the right thing was reward enough for him. As he approached the towering glass doors of the office building, his nerves began to stir. This wasn't just about returning a lost item anymore. This felt bigger, like a pivotal moment in his life, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the significance of the choice he had made, or maybe it was the hope that this act would somehow turn the tide of his current misfortunes. The lobby of the building was sleek and modern, with marble floors that gleamed under the soft lighting. James approached the reception desk, where a woman with a friendly smile greeted him. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked, looking up from her computer. "I'm here to see Mr. Harris," James said, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "I found something that belongs to him." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Do you have an appointment?" James shook his head. "No, I don't, but it's important. It won't take long." She hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing whether or not to let him through. After a quick glance at the clock, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. "I'll see if he's available. What's your name?" "James Parker." The receptionist spoke briefly into the phone before nodding and gesturing for him to sit. "Mr. Harris is in a meeting right now, but he should be available shortly. Please have a seat." James sat down in one of the sleek leather chairs, trying to calm his nerves. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one filled with growing anticipation. He ran through different scenarios in his head. How he'd introduce himself, how Harris would react, whether the man would be in a rush or take the time to appreciate what James was doing. It wasn't long before a middle-aged man appeared in the hallway, dressed in a sharp suit and carrying an air of authority about him. His hair was graying at the temples, and his expression was one of quiet confidence. James recognized him instantly. It was Jacob Harris. Harris walked up to the receptionist, and after a quick exchange of words, he turned his attention to James. "Mr. Parker?" he asked, his voice smooth but commanding. James stood up and offered his hand. "Yes, sir. I believe this belongs to you," he said, pulling the wallet from his pocket and holding it out. Harris looked at the wallet, his expression changing from one of curiosity to surprise. He took it from James's hand, flipping it open to inspect the contents. After a moment, he looked back up at James, his eyes filled with gratitude and perhaps a hint of disbelief. "I had no idea this was missing," Harris admitted, shaking his head. "You could have easily kept this and walked away, but you didn't." James shrugged, feeling a bit awkward under the man's gaze. "It just didn't feel right. I saw your name on the cards and knew I had to return it." Harris stared at him for a moment longer, clearly taken aback by the honesty of the man standing before him. He took a deep breath and closed the wallet, placing it back in his pocket. "You have no idea how much I appreciate this," he said sincerely. "It's rare to meet someone these days who would go out of their way to do the right thing." James gave a modest nod. "I just figured it's what I'd hope someone would do for me if the situation were reversed." Harris smiled, though it was a thoughtful, almost reflective smile. "If more people thought like you, this world would be a much better place." There was a brief pause, and then Harris gestured toward the hallway. "Please, come to my office for a moment. I'd like to talk with you if you have time." James hesitated. He hadn't expected this. In his mind, he'd return the wallet, exchange a few polite words, and be on his way. But Harris seemed genuinely interested in talking further. He followed the businessman down the hall, his curiosity growing. Harris's office was large and tastefully decorated, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. A polished wooden desk sat in the center of the room, but the atmosphere wasn't intimidating. There was a warmth to it, a reflection of the man who occupied the space. Harris gestured for James to sit in one of the comfortable chairs across from his desk. Once they were seated, Harris leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the desk. "Tell me, James, what do you do for work?" James's face tightened slightly at the question. He hadn't expected to share his personal struggles. "I'm between jobs right now," he admitted. "I used to work at the manufacturing plant on the other side of town, but I got laid off a few months ago." Harris nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving James's face. "I'm sorry to hear that. It's tough out there right now. Are you looking for something new?" "Every day," James replied with a half-smile. "It's been a rough few months, but I'll figure something out." Harris leaned back in his chair, still studying James with a kind of quiet intensity. "You know, I've met a lot of people in my line of work. People who are ambitious, driven, and talented. But rarely do I meet someone with your level of integrity. It's clear to me that you're someone who does the right thing, no matter how difficult the circumstances." James shifted slightly in his chair, not entirely sure where the conversation was headed. "I'd like to offer you something," Harris continued. "I've been looking for someone to help manage one of my smaller businesses. A position that requires honesty, dedication, and a strong work ethic. From what I can see, you have all those qualities. How would you feel about joining my team?" James blinked, stunned by the offer. It wasn't what he'd expected at all. A job? After all this time searching, could it really be this simple? "I don't know what to say," James stammered, his mind racing to catch up with the sudden opportunity. "Are you serious?" Harris smiled warmly. "Very serious. I believe in rewarding people who demonstrate strong character. And you, James, are the kind of person I want in my company." James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Relief, gratitude, and a deep sense of validation. All the struggles, all the sacrifices, all the times he had chosen to do the right thing, even when it was hard. This moment made it all worthwhile. "I would be honored," James finally said, his voice filled with sincerity. Harris stood and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, James." As they shook hands, James felt the weight of his past struggles begin to lift. This simple act of returning a wallet had turned into something so much more. He had chosen the harder path, and now life was offering him a chance he never expected. It was the beginning of a new chapter for James Parker, a chapter defined not by struggle but by opportunity, and most importantly, by the strength of character that had led him here. James left Jacob Harris's office feeling lighter than he had in months. The sun shone brighter, the air felt fresher, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like everything might finally be turning around. The opportunity Harris had offered wasn't just any job. It was a real chance for stability, for a better future for his family. It wasn't only the relief of a steady paycheck that lifted his spirits, but also the validation that his integrity had brought him this far. As he walked back through the streets of downtown, the realization of what had just happened started to settle in. His mind was racing with thoughts of how different things could be now. He imagined the look on Sarah's face when he told her the news. She had been his rock for so long, holding the family together when things seemed impossible. This job would change everything. When James finally reached home, he found Sarah in the kitchen again, washing dishes from breakfast. The sound of the faucet running and the clatter of plates in the sink filled the room. But as soon as she saw him, she turned and wiped her hands on a towel, a curious expression on her face. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said, her tone cautious but hopeful. James stepped forward, the smile on his face impossible to hide. He reached out and took both of her hands in his eyes shining with excitement. "You're not going to believe this." Sarah tilted her head, studying him closely, her own smile starting to form. "What happened?" "I met Jacob Harris," James said, his voice full of energy. "I returned the wallet and we talked. Sarah, he offered me a job." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, her expression frozen between disbelief and shock. "A job? What do you mean?" "He said he was impressed with my honesty and offered me a position in one of his businesses. It's a management role. Steady pay, benefits, everything we've needed." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled up in her eyes. She had held it together for so long, staying strong for James and the kids, but this news broke through her walls. "Oh my God, James. Are you serious?" James nodded, his own emotions bubbling to the surface. He pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling her body shake with relieved sobs. "I'm serious. Things are finally going to get better. We're going to be okay." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the kitchen, surrounded by the quiet sounds of their home. For months, they had been waiting for a break, for something to shift, and now it had. James had been on the edge of despair, tempted by an easy solution when he found that wallet, but now the decision to return it felt more important than ever. Doing the right thing hadn't just saved his conscience, it had saved his family's future. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table with Amy and Daniel, the mood was different. There was laughter and lightness in the air that hadn't been there for months. The children, oblivious to the seriousness of their parents' struggles, were thrilled when James announced the news about his new job. "I'm going to be working for Mr. Harris," he explained to them. That means we won't have to worry as much anymore." Amy, who had been quiet for most of the meal, looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Does that mean I can get those new shoes for school?" James chuckled, ruffling her hair. "It means we can start taking care of a lot of things, sweetheart. But first, we're going to make sure we save enough to keep everything in order, okay?" Amy nodded, satisfied with his answer, while Daniel, too young to fully understand, simply beamed at his dad with pride. James couldn't help but smile as he looked around the table, feeling the warmth of his family's love and support. After dinner, James stepped outside for a moment to take in the evening air. The neighborhood was quiet, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun set behind the rows of houses. As he stood there, he couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if he had made a different choice when he found the wallet. What if he had kept the money? What if he had let the desperation he felt in that moment cloud his judgment? The consequences of those decisions ran through his mind, and he realized that this wasn't just about honesty. It was about trust. Trust in himself, in his values, and in the idea that sometimes doing the right thing, even when it seems like no one is watching, leads to greater rewards than you can ever imagine. The next few days were a whirlwind of change. James met with Harris's team, signed the paperwork, and officially became part of the company. The job came with a decent salary, more than enough to cover their bills and start saving for the future. It also provided health insurance and benefits, things that had been a source of anxiety for Sarah as they struggled to make ends meet. Now, for the first time in months, they could breathe easier. At work, James quickly earned the respect of his colleagues. His honesty and straightforward nature stood out, and it wasn't long before he was known not just as the new guy, but as someone people could rely on. Harris himself checked in regularly, offering advice and guidance. He treated James with the same respect and kindness that he had shown during their first meeting, and James couldn't help but feel grateful for the man's belief in him. But the story didn't end there. News of what had happened began to spread throughout the community. A few local journalists caught wind of James's decision to return the wallet and how that act of integrity had led to his new job. What started as a small personal moment quickly became something much larger. Articles were written highlighting James's honesty, and soon his story became an inspiration for others. People in the neighborhood started talking about it, parents sharing the tale with their children, teachers using it as an example in classrooms. The ripple effect was undeniable. James's small act of honesty had become a symbol of hope in a community that had been struggling with its own challenges. Crime rates in the area had been rising, and trust between neighbors had been eroding. But James's story reminded people of the power of doing the right thing, even when no one is looking. One evening, as James and Sarah were out for a walk, a woman stopped them on the street. She smiled warmly at them and said, "You're James Parker, right? I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it's inspired me. My husband and I have been going through a rough patch, but after hearing your story, we're trying to be more grateful for the little things. You reminded us that there's still good in the world." James was taken aback, not used to this kind of attention. "Thank you," he replied, genuinely touched by her words. "I was just doing what I thought was right." She nodded, her smile never fading. "That's exactly why it means so much." As the woman walked away, James turned to Sarah, who was beaming with pride. "I never expected any of this," he said softly. "That's what makes it so powerful," Sarah replied. "You didn't do it for the attention or the reward. You did it because it was the right thing. And now, look at what it's become." James wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close as they continued their walk. The future felt brighter now, not just for their family, but for the entire community. What had started as a simple act of honesty had blossomed into something far greater than James could have ever imagined, a reminder that integrity, kindness, and trust could still change the world, one small act at a time. As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, James smiled to himself, knowing that his journey was far from over. But wherever life took him next, he would carry with him the lesson that had led him to this moment. That even in the darkest of times, doing the right thing would always light the way forward. The news of James Parker's selfless act continued to spread like wildfire, far beyond his expectations. What had begun as a simple, private decision to return a lost wallet now had a life of its own. James found himself unexpectedly at the center of attention, with local news stations covering his story and even radio talk shows discussing the rarity of honesty in today's world. At first, James was uncomfortable with all the attention. He had never sought recognition for what he considered a basic act of integrity. He'd simply done what he believed was right, and now his life was changing in ways he couldn't have predicted. The phone began ringing more often, with reporters wanting interviews and community leaders praising his example of kindness and honesty. But the most profound impact was felt closer to home. Neighbors who had previously only nodded politely began stopping by to say hello, to ask how he and his family were doing, and to tell him how his story had touched them. Some shared their own struggles, saying they felt inspired by his example to make better choices in their lives. One evening, a knock on the door startled James. He opened it to find his next-door neighbor, a man named Tony, standing awkwardly on the porch. Tony had lived next to James for years, but they'd never exchanged more than a few words. "Hey, James," Tony began, looking down at his feet. "I've been meaning to come by. I just wanted to say thanks." "For what?" James asked, genuinely surprised. Tony shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. I read about what you did. Returning that wallet and all. It made me think. Well, I've been a bit of a jerk, keeping to myself, not really looking out for anyone else. But you reminded me that we all need to be better, to take care of each other. I've been too focused on my own problems. Anyway, I just wanted to say, thanks. You've made me want to try harder. James was taken aback by the sincerity in Tony's voice. He had never thought of himself as someone who could inspire others, let alone his neighbors. They shook hands and Tony left, but James stood on the porch for a long time after, reflecting on how much things had changed. The ripple effect of his honesty was becoming more evident with each passing day. In the weeks following the wallet incident, small acts of kindness began to bloom around the neighborhood. People who had once been strangers now stopped to help each other. Children left notes of encouragement on doorsteps, and families began organizing community cleanup days, bringing the neighborhood together in ways James had never seen before. Even at work, the atmosphere shifted. Jacob Harris, true to his word, had placed James in a management position where his values were appreciated and where he quickly earned the respect of his colleagues. But it wasn't just about the paycheck or the stability the job provided. It was about something deeper. James felt like he was part of something larger than himself, a company that valued integrity and hard work. During one team meeting, Harris pulled James aside afterward. "You're doing a great job here, James," he said. "I knew from the moment you returned that wallet that you were someone who could make a difference, not just in my company but in the lives of everyone around you. Keep it up. We need more people like you." The words resonated with James. He didn't see himself as a hero or even particularly special. But if his actions could continue to inspire others, he realized he had a responsibility to live up to the example people now saw in him. At home, life was better than it had been in years. The weight of financial stress had finally lifted, and James and Sarah found themselves laughing more, enjoying time with their children without the constant shadow of worry hanging over them. Amy and Daniel, still too young to fully understand the gravity of what their father had done, beamed with pride every time they overheard someone mention their dad in glowing terms. One afternoon, as they sat down for dinner, Amy turned to her father with a serious expression. "Dad," she said, "everyone at school keeps talking about how you're famous now because you gave back that man's wallet. Is that why we're not poor anymore?" James chuckled, taken aback by the innocence of her question. "Well, Amy," he began, "it's not just about the wallet. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Sometimes when you make the right choices, good things happen in ways you don't expect." Amy nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her father's words with the weight of a much older person. "So if I'm honest, will good things happen to me too?" James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I think so. Maybe not right away, but being honest and kind will always lead to good things. Sometimes the rewards aren't about money or getting a job. Sometimes the reward is just knowing you've done the right thing. As the months passed, the story of James's honesty continued to echo throughout the community and beyond. More people began to embrace the values of kindness and integrity, creating a wave of positivity that swept through the town. Donations to local charities increased, volunteer groups sprang up to help those in need, and there was a renewed sense of trust among neighbors. Even the local police reported a drop in petty crimes as the community began to heal and reconnect. One day, James was invited to speak at a local event organized by the town's council. They wanted him to share his story, hoping it would continue to inspire others. James was nervous at the prospect of speaking in front of so many people, but Sarah encouraged him. "You don't have to be a public speaker, James," she said. "Just be yourself. People connect with you because you're genuine. Just talk about what you've been through, and they'll listen." The day of the event arrived, and as James stood on the stage looking out at the sea of faces, friends, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers, he felt a sense of gratitude. He cleared his throat and began speaking. "I never thought something as small as returning a wallet would lead to all of this," he started. "But what I've learned is that sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference. I wasn't trying to be a hero or make a statement. I just wanted to do what was right. And what I've seen since then is that when you act with integrity, it inspires others to do the same. Kindness and honesty are contagious. We all have the power to create change, not through big, grand gestures, but through small, everyday actions." As he finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. James stepped off the stage, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment, not for himself, but for the community that had come together, all because of one simple act of honesty. In the end, James realized that the true reward wasn't the job, the recognition, or even the financial stability. It was the knowledge that his decision had made a difference, that he had played a part in uplifting his community. And as he walked hand in hand with Sarah back to their car that evening, he smiled, knowing that his journey was far from over. Whatever challenges the future might bring, he would face them with the same values that had guided him through the darkest times: honesty, kindness, and trust in doing what was right. And as long as he stayed true to those principles, he knew everything would be okay. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.